The decision to invade Iraq in 2003 was the most consequential American foreign policy choice of the 21st century. It unleashed forces that reshaped the Middle East and the world. It cost thousands of American lives and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives. It consumed trillions of dollars. It damaged America's international standing. It empowered Iran. It created ISIS. It changed how Americans view military intervention. The war began with supremely confident predictions of swift victory and grateful liberation. It ended in ambiguous withdrawal after years of grinding insurgency. This is the story of the Iraq War. The origins of the war reach back before September 11, 2001. Iraq had been a problem for American foreign policy since Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990. The Gulf War expelled Iraqi forces from Kuwait, but left Saddam in power. The decision not to march to Baghdad and overthrow Saddam was deliberate. President George H.W. Bush and his advisors believed that occupying Iraq would be costly and destabilizing. They chose containment over regime change, but this choice left unfinished business that would haunt American policy for a decade. The containment of Iraq through the 1990s was costly and controversial. No-fly zones were enforced over northern and southern Iraq. American and British aircraft patrolled these zones daily. Iraqi air defenses fired at them regularly. Coalition aircraft struck back at Iraqi military installations. This low-level conflict continued for 12 years with little public attention. Sanctions prevented Iraq from importing weapons and controlled its oil revenues. UN weapons inspectors searched for weapons of mass destruction and dismantled Iraqi weapons programs. Saddam Hussein played a dangerous game with the inspections regime. He complied partially while maintaining ambiguity about whether weapons still existed. He expelled inspectors when searches came too close to sensitive sites. He filed false declarations. He obstructed and delayed. His behavior suggested he was hiding something. Intelligence agencies concluded that Iraq maintained chemical and biological weapons programs. They believed Iraq was pursuing nuclear weapons. These assessments were based on Saddam's behavior, defector testimony, and incomplete intelligence. They would prove catastrophically wrong. The September 11th attacks transformed American national security priorities. The attacks demonstrated that terrorists could strike America's homeland with devastating effect. The possibility that terrorists could acquire weapons of mass destruction became a central concern. President George W. Bush declared that America would make no distinction between terrorists and the states that harbored them. Afghanistan, which harbored al-Qaeda, was the immediate target. But Iraq was in the administration's sights from the beginning. Within hours of the September 11th attacks, senior officials in the Bush administration were discussing Iraq. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld suggested striking Iraq along with Afghanistan. Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz argued that Iraq was involved in the attacks or would be involved in future attacks. The evidence for Iraqi involvement in September 11th was non-existent, but the desire to deal with Iraq was strong among key administration officials. They saw September 11th as an opportunity to finish the unfinished business of the Gulf War. The Bush administration's worldview was shaped by the experience of September 11th. The attacks shattered assumptions about American security. If terrorists could fly planes into the World Trade Center and Pentagon, what else might they do? The nightmare scenario was terrorists acquiring nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. Preventing this became the paramount concern. States that possessed such weapons and supported terrorism had to be dealt with preemptively. Waiting for threats to materialize was too dangerous. This logic led directly to Iraq. The case for war with Iraq was built on several claims. First, Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction in violation of UN resolutions. Second, Saddam Hussein had used such weapons against his own people and against Iran. Third, Iraq maintained ties to terrorist groups. Fourth, the combination of WMD, terrorist ties, and Saddam's aggressive history created an unacceptable threat. Fifth, containment was failing and could not be sustained indefinitely. Sixth, regime change would transform Iraq into a stable democracy that would serve as a model for the Middle East. Each of these claims was questionable or false, but they formed the basis for war. The Bush administration began building the case for war publicly in 2002. The campaign was sophisticated and comprehensive. Senior officials gave speeches warning of Iraqi threats. Intelligence assessments were selectively declassified and presented to the public. The media coverage amplified these warnings. The message was consistent. Iraq posed a grave and gathering danger that required action. The American public, still traumatized by September 11th and primed to support action against threats, was receptive to these arguments. President Bush's State of the Union address in January 2002 introduced the concept of the axis of evil. He named Iraq, Iran, and North Korea as states that sponsored terrorism and sought weapons of mass destruction. The speech signaled that Iraq would be a priority. Bush declared that America would not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons. The implication was clear. America was prepared to act against Iraq with or without international support. Vice President Dick Cheney was the most forceful advocate for war within the administration. In a speech in August 2002, Cheney declared that there was no doubt that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. He warned that Saddam would acquire nuclear weapons fairly soon. He argued that inspections would not work because Saddam would deceive inspectors. He suggested that action was necessary and inevitable. Cheney's certainty was not supported by intelligence, but it was politically influential. His speech marked the point where war became almost inevitable. Secretary of State Colin Powell was more cautious about war with Iraq. Powell had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs during the Gulf War. He understood the difficulties of military operations and the complexities of the Middle East. Powell advocated working through the United Nations and building an international coalition. He believed that if war became necessary, it should be conducted with overwhelming force and international legitimacy. His caution was overruled by others in the administration who viewed UN involvement as an obstacle and delay. The intelligence community came under enormous pressure to support the case for war. Policymakers wanted intelligence that confirmed their assumptions about Iraqi weapons programs. Analysts who questioned the evidence or offered alternative interpretations were marginalized. Intelligence that supported the threat narrative was embraced and amplified. Intelligence that contradicted it was dismissed or ignored. The result was intelligence assessments that told policymakers what they wanted to hear rather than what the evidence actually supported. The National Intelligence Estimate on Iraq's weapons programs, completed in October 2002, reflected this pressure. The NI concluded with high confidence that Iraq possessed chemical and biological weapons. It assessed that Iraq was reconstituting its nuclear program. It suggested Iraq might have operational nuclear weapons within a decade. These conclusions were based on incomplete evidence, questionable sources, and analytical assumptions. Dissenting views were relegated to footnotes. The NI became the authoritative basis for claims about Iraqi weapons despite its flawed foundations. Congress debated authorizing military action against Iraq in October 2002. The debate occurred in the shadow of the September 11th attacks and the upcoming midterm elections. Few members of Congress wanted to appear weak on national security. The Bush administration shared selected intelligence with Congress to support the case for war. The intelligence was presented with certainty that the full classified assessments did not support. Many Democrats who were skeptical about war felt political pressure to support the authorization. The authorization for use of military force against Iraq passed with bipartisan support. The Senate voted 77 to 23 in favor. The House voted 296 to 133 in favor. The Bush administration pursued a UN resolution authorizing force against Iraq. This effort was led reluctantly by Colin Powell, who believed UN involvement was important for international legitimacy. The result was Security Council Resolution 1441, passed unanimously in November 2002. The resolution declared Iraq in material breach of previous resolutions. It demanded that Iraq cooperate fully with weapons inspectors. It warned of serious consequences if Iraq failed to comply. The resolution did not explicitly authorize military force, but the Bush administration claimed it provided sufficient legal basis for war. UN weapons inspectors returned to Iraq in November 2000 for the first time since 1998. The inspection team was led by Hans Blix for conventional and chemical weapons and Mohammed El-Baradei for nuclear programs. The inspectors conducted hundreds of inspections over the following months. They found no evidence of active weapons programs. Iraq's cooperation was incomplete but improving. Blix and El-Baradei requested more time to complete their work. They believed inspections were working and that war was unnecessary. The Bush administration dismissed their findings and insisted that Iraq was hiding weapons. The attempt to obtain a second UN resolution explicitly authorizing war failed. The Bush administration wanted Security Council endorsement for military action, but opposition was strong. France, Germany, and Russia opposed war. They argued that inspections were working and should continue. They believed war was unjustified and would be destabilizing. The Bush administration needed 9 votes in the Security Council and faced certain vetoes from France and Russia. Rather than face a humiliating defeat, the administration withdrew the resolution. War would proceed without explicit UN authorization. The failure to obtain UN support damaged the coalition that would invade Iraq. The Gulf War coalition had included dozens of nations providing troops and legitimacy. The 2003 invasion would be conducted primarily by American and British forces with token contributions from others. The Coalition of the Willing, as it was called, included nations that provided political support but minimal military forces. The absence of broad international support undermined the war's legitimacy from the beginning. It suggested that America was acting unilaterally based on evidence others found unconvincing. The decision for war was made in early 2003 despite the lack of smoking gun evidence of weapons programs. Bush administration officials were convinced that Saddam possessed WMD regardless of what inspectors found. They believed inspections were a waste of time. They argued that Saddam's history and behavior proved his intent and capability. The absence of evidence was treated as evidence of concealment rather than evidence of absence. The decision to invade was based on assumptions and fears rather than concrete proof. This would have devastating consequences for American credibility. Colin Powell's presentation to the UN Security Council on February 5, 2003 was intended to provide definitive proof of Iraqi weapons programs. Powell was chosen because his credibility was higher than other administration officials. His presentation included satellite photos, intercepted communications, and defector testimony. He described Iraqi mobile biological weapons laboratories. He discussed aluminum tubes allegedly for uranium enrichment. He suggested links between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. The presentation was treated as definitive proof. Almost every major claim would later be proven false. The case for war included significant deceptions and exaggerations. The claim that Iraq sought uranium from Niger was based on forged documents. The source for mobile biological labs was a fabricator codenamed Curveball whose information was known to be unreliable. The aluminum tubes were more likely for conventional rockets than uranium enrichment. The suggested links between Iraq and al-Qaeda were tenuous and rejected by intelligence analysts. The Bush administration presented these claims with absolute certainty despite knowing they were questionable. The deception was deliberate and consequential. The anti-war movement grew through late 2002 and early 2003. Millions of people around the world protested against the impending war. On February 15, 2003, coordinated protests occurred in cities worldwide. Between 10 and 15 million people participated, making it perhaps the largest protest in human history. In London, over 1 million people marched. In Rome, 3 million protested. In New York, hundreds of thousands braved cold weather to oppose the war. The protests had no effect on administration policy. Bush dismissed the protesters and proceeded with war plans. Military planning for the invasion proceeded through 2002 and early 2003. The plan was developed by General Tommy Franks and the U.S. Central Command. It reflected Donald Rumsfeld's belief in military transformation. Rumsfeld wanted a smaller, faster, more technologically advanced force. He rejected the Powell Doctrine's emphasis on overwhelming force. The invasion force would be approximately 150,000 troops, far smaller than the Gulf War's 500,000. The plan assumed Iraqi resistance would be minimal. It assumed Iraqis would welcome liberation. It assumed the Iraqi government and infrastructure would remain largely intact and simply change management. Each assumption was wrong. The plan for post-invasion Iraq was shockingly inadequate. The State Department had conducted extensive planning through the Future of Iraq project. Experts had identified challenges including sectarian conflict, infrastructure needs, and governance vacuums. Their work was largely ignored by the Pentagon, which controlled post-war planning. Rumsfeld and his deputies assumed that Iraqis would quickly establish a functioning government. They believed American forces would be greeted as liberators and could draw down quickly. They rejected calls for more troops to provide security. They dismissed warnings about potential chaos. The failure to plan adequately for the post-invasion period was the war's original sin. The invasion of Iraq began on March 19, 2003, with a decapitation strike. American intelligence believed Saddam Hussein was meeting with senior officials at a compound in Baghdad. President Bush authorized an immediate attack before the planned invasion timeline. Cruise missiles and bunker-busting bombs struck the compound. The goal was to kill Saddam and potentially end the war before it began. The strike failed. Saddam was not at the location. The war would proceed as planned. Within hours, the ground invasion began. The military campaign was titled Operation Iraqi Freedom. Coalition forces crossed into Iraq from Kuwait in the pre-dawn darkness of March 20, 2003. The invasion force consisted of approximately 150,000 American troops and 45,000 British troops. Smaller contingents from Australia and Poland participated. The force was divided into multiple axes of advance. The main effort drove north toward Baghdad. British forces moved to secure the southern city of Basra. Marines advanced along the Tigris River Valley. The invasion was the largest American military operation since the Gulf War. The initial advance was swift and dramatic. Iraqi resistance was scattered and ineffective. The Iraqi military, decimated by sanctions and neglect, offered little organized opposition. Many Iraqi units simply dissolved. Soldiers shed their uniforms and went home. The highway north from Kuwait to Baghdad became a massive traffic jam of American military vehicles. Embedded journalists broadcast live from vehicles racing across the desert. The images of rapid advance dominated television coverage. The invasion looked like the easy victory the administration had promised. The 3rd Infantry Division led the drive toward Baghdad. They advanced hundreds of miles in the first days. They bypassed cities rather than clearing them. The strategy was to reach Baghdad quickly and decapitate the regime. Securing territory would come later. This approach created vulnerabilities. Iraqi irregular forces, called Fedayeen Saddam, attacked supply lines. They ambushed convoys. They harassed isolated units. These attacks were not enough to stop the advance, but they foreshadowed the insurgency to come. The Battle of Nasiriyah on March 23rd was the first significant engagement. American Marines fought to secure bridges over the Euphrates River. Iraqi forces put up fierce resistance. American vehicles were ambushed. Casualties mounted. 18 Americans were killed in fighting around the city. It was a reminder that not all Iraqis would welcome liberation. The battle also saw the ambush of the 507th Maintenance Company. 11 soldiers were killed and 7 captured, including Private Jessica Lynch, whose capture and later rescue became major media stories. British forces surrounded Basra, Iraq's 2nd largest city. They faced a dilemma. Assaulting the city would cause civilian casualties. But leaving it under regime control threatened their supply lines. The British chose a methodical approach. They conducted raids into the city. They targeted regime leadership. They waited for conditions to allow entry with minimal fighting. Basra fell after several weeks. British forces discovered the city's infrastructure was in worse condition than expected. Years of sanctions and neglect had devastated basic services. The sandstorm that struck on March 25th halted the advance temporarily. Visibility dropped to near zero. Aircraft were grounded. Vehicles could barely move. The pause gave Iraqi forces time to reposition. It also gave critics of the war an opportunity to question the strategy. Media reports suggested the invasion was stalling. Some military analysts claimed that Rumsfeld's light force was insufficient. The criticism infuriated administration officials. Within days, the sandstorm cleared and the advance resumed. The brief pause was forgotten in the rush toward Baghdad. American forces reached Baghdad's outskirts by early April. The question was how to take the city. Military planners feared urban warfare would be costly and destructive. They remembered Grozny, Stalingrad, and other cities destroyed in urban combat. But Iraqi resistance was collapsing faster than expected. Commanders decided to conduct armored raids into the city to test defenses. If resistance was light, the raids would become an occupation. If resistance was heavy, forces would withdraw and reassess. The thunder runs into Baghdad on April 5th and 7th were gambles that paid off. Armored columns of tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles drove through Baghdad. They engaged Iraqi forces but met limited organized resistance. The second thunder run seized the presidential palace and nearby government buildings. Iraqi defenders fired from buildings and alleys. American armor and air support overwhelmed them. By April 9th, American forces controlled central Baghdad. The regime had collapsed. Saddam and his top officials had fled. The toppling of Saddam's statue in Firdos Square on April 9th became the iconic image of the invasion. American troops helped Iraqi civilians pull down the massive statue. The scene was broadcast worldwide. It appeared to show jubilant Iraqis celebrating liberation. The reality was more complex. The crowd was relatively small. The event was partly orchestrated by American psychological operations, but the image served its purpose. It suggested the Iraqi people welcomed liberation and that the war was won. Both impressions were premature. President Bush declared major combat operations over on May 1, 2003. He spoke from the deck of the aircraft carrier, USS Abraham Lincoln. Behind him hung a banner reading "Mission Accomplished." Bush declared that in the Battle of Iraq, the United States and its allies have prevailed. He acknowledged that difficult work remained but suggested the hard part was finished. The speech and the banner became symbols of the administration's premature triumphalism. The hard part was just beginning. The initial weeks after the invasion saw a collapse of order in Baghdad and other cities. Government ministries were looted, museums were ransacked, hospitals were stripped of equipment, power plants and water treatment facilities were damaged or destroyed. Criminal gangs roamed freely. American forces did not have enough troops to secure the cities. They focused on protecting government buildings and their own bases. The chaos destroyed infrastructure and created resentment. Iraqis wondered why the mighty American military could not provide basic security. The looting of the National Museum of Iraq was particularly tragic. The museum held priceless artifacts from Mesopotamian civilizations. Looters stole or destroyed thousands of items. The losses were catastrophic for human cultural heritage. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld dismissed the looting as the untidiness of freedom. His flippant response outraged archaeologists and historians. It also suggested that American forces were unprepared for the responsibilities of occupation. The failure to secure the museum became a symbol of broader failures in post-invasion planning. The Coalition Provisional Authority was established to govern Iraq during the transition to Iraqi sovereignty. L. Paul Bremer III was appointed as the CPAS administrator. Bremer arrived in Baghdad in May 2003 with broad authority and limited preparation. He was supposed to work with existing Iraqi institutions to transfer power quickly. Instead, he made decisions that fundamentally altered the occupation's trajectory. His first major orders would prove disastrous. CPA Order No. 1 announced de-Baathification of Iraqi society. The Baath Party had controlled Iraq for decades. Membership was often required for government employment. Bremer's order banned senior Baath Party members from government positions. It extended several levels down the party hierarchy. The order was supposed to remove Saddam loyalists. In practice, it removed experienced administrators, teachers, and technocrats. Hospitals lost doctors, schools lost teachers, ministries lost experienced civil servants. The order created unemployment and resentment among Sunni Arabs who had dominated the Baath Party. CPA Order No. 2 dissolved the Iraqi military and security forces. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and police were dismissed. They were sent home without jobs or pensions. The order was intended to build new security forces loyal to a new Iraq. But it put hundreds of thousands of armed, trained men on the street with no income. Many had families to support. They felt humiliated and betrayed. They would form the core of the insurgency that followed. The decision to dissolve the military was arguably the single worst decision of the occupation. These two orders created the conditions for insurgency. The de-Baathification created a class of unemployed, resentful Sunni Arabs. The dissolution of the military armed and trained them. Together, the orders transformed potential allies into enemies. The insurgency that developed was not inevitable. It was created by catastrophic policy choices. Bremer later defended the decisions as necessary to build a new Iraq. But at the time, many military commanders and regional experts argued they were mistakes. Their warnings were ignored. The search for weapons of mass destruction found nothing. American forces had deployed specialized units to locate and secure WMD. They searched suspected sites identified by intelligence. They interviewed Iraqi scientists and officials. They found no stockpiles of chemical or biological weapons. They found no active nuclear program. They found no evidence that WMD had been moved to Syria as some claimed. The weapons that had justified the war did not exist. The intelligence had been wrong. The administration's certainty had been unfounded. The absence of WMD was a slow-motion scandal. Initial reports suggested the weapons might still be found. The administration claims Saddam had destroyed them before the invasion. They suggested evidence was hidden or scattered. David K. led the Iraq Survey Group charged with finding WMD. In October 2003, he reported that no weapons had been found, but the search continued. In January 2004, K testified to Congress that we were almost all wrong about WMD. The admission was devastating. The war's primary justification had evaporated. The insurgency began in summer 2003. Small arms attacks on American patrols increased. Improvised explosive devices appeared on roadsides. American soldiers were dying daily. The attacks were initially dismissed as dead-enders and regime loyalists, but the violence spread and intensified. By fall 2003, it was clear that a full-scale insurgency had emerged. The mission had shifted from invasion to counterinsurgency. American forces were not prepared for this mission. Their training and equipment were designed for conventional warfare, not for fighting insurgents among civilian populations. The insurgency was fragmented and diverse. Former regime elements, including disbanded military and intelligence officers, conducted attacks to destabilize the occupation. Sunni tribal fighters opposed the foreign occupation and the empowerment of Shia and Kurds. Foreign jihadists entered Iraq to fight Americans. Criminal gangs exploited the chaos. The insurgent groups had different goals and sometimes fought each other, but they shared opposition to the American occupation. They coordinated attacks when convenient and acted independently otherwise. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi emerged as a key insurgent leader. He was a Jordanian jihadist who had fought in Afghanistan. Zarqawi entered Iraq before the invasion. He established al-Qaeda in Iraq, which would evolve into ISIS. Zarqawi's group focused on spectacular attacks designed to provoke sectarian conflict. They bombed Shia mosques and markets. They kidnapped and beheaded hostages on video. They attacked UN and Red Cross facilities. Zarqawi's brutality was shocking even by jihadist standards. His campaign of sectarian violence pushed Iraq towards civil war. The bombing of the UN headquarters in Baghdad on August 19, 2003, killed 22 people, including UN envoy Sergio Vieira de Mello. The attack shocked the international community. The UN was supposed to be neutral and humanitarian. The bombing suggested that no one was safe in Iraq. The UN withdrew most of its staff. International organizations reduced their presence. The occupation lost international legitimacy and assistance. Reconstruction became harder. The burden fell more heavily on American forces who were already overstretched. American forces adapted slowly to counterinsurgency. Initial tactics were heavy-handed. Raids on homes alienated civilians. Mass arrests filled detention facilities with people who had little intelligence value. The treatment of detainees was often harsh. Cultural misunderstandings created resentment. Checkpoints where nervous soldiers sometimes shot civilians eroded trust. Each mistake created more insurgents. The military was learning counterinsurgency through trial and error. The cost of this education was measured in lives. The capture of Saddam Hussein on December 13, 2003, was a major victory. American forces found him hiding in a hole near his hometown of Tikrit. He was disheveled and passive when captured. The video of his medical examination was broadcast worldwide. The former dictator was reduced to a prisoner. His capture was supposed to break the insurgency. The administration suggested that resistance would fade without Saddam. This proved false. The insurgency continued and intensified. Saddam had not been directing it. His capture changed little. The year 2004 saw the insurgency explode in violence. Two major battles in Fallujah defined the year. The first battle came in April after American contractors were killed and their bodies mutilated and hung from a bridge. The images shocked America. The military laid siege to Fallujah. But the assault was halted after political pressure from the Iraqi Governing Council and international criticism of civilian casualties. The partial withdrawal was seen as a victory by insurgents. Fallujah became an insurgent stronghold. The Mahdi Army uprising in April 2004 opened a second front. Muqtada al-Sadr was a young Shia cleric with a militia. His forces controlled much of eastern Baghdad and parts of southern Iraq. Sadr opposed the occupation and demanded immediate Iraqi sovereignty. When the CPA moved against him, his militia launched attacks on American and coalition forces. Fighting erupted across southern Iraq. American forces battled Mahdi army fighters in Najaf, Karbala, and Baghdad's Sadr city. The uprising demonstrated that the occupation faced Shia as well as Sunni opposition. The Abu Ghraib scandal broke in April 2004 when photographs of detainee abuse were broadcast. The images showed American soldiers humiliating and torturing Iraqi prisoners. Detainees were shown naked, in stress positions, threatened by dogs, and subjected to sexual humiliation. The photographs were taken by the abusers themselves. The images went viral globally. They were used as propaganda by insurgent groups. They confirmed the worst stereotypes of American occupation. The scandal was a devastating blow to American credibility and moral authority. The abuse at Abu Ghraib was not the work of a few bad apples, as the administration claimed. It reflected systemic problems in detainee operations. Detention facilities were overcrowded. Interrogation techniques were harsh and sometimes illegal. Oversight was minimal. Military police were ordered to soften up detainees for interrogation. The legal framework that permitted enhanced interrogation in the war on terror created an environment where abuse occurred. Low-ranking soldiers were court-martialed. Senior officers and civilian officials escaped accountability. The second Battle of Fallujah in November 2004 was the heaviest urban combat since the Vietnam War. American and Iraqi forces assaulted the city to clear it of insurgents. The battle was preceded by an evacuation of civilians and weeks of airstrikes. The assault was methodical and destructive. Marines fought building by building through the city. The fighting was intense and brutal. 95 Americans were killed and hundreds wounded. Insurgent casualties were estimated in the hundreds. The city was devastated. Most of it was destroyed. The battle cleared Fallujah, but insurgents simply moved to other areas. The year 2004 saw nearly 850 American service members killed in Iraq. It was the deadliest year of the war. Improvised explosive devices were the primary killer. These homemade bombs ranged from simple artillery shells to complex devices that could penetrate armor. They were buried in roads, hidden in trash, attached to cars. They killed and maimed soldiers in vehicles and on foot. The IED threat transformed how American forces operated. Vehicles were armored, routes were swept for bombs. Movements became predictable. The tactical adjustments saved lives but could not eliminate the threat. The January 2005 elections were supposed to be a turning point. Iraqis would elect a transitional national assembly to draft a new constitution. The elections were Iraq's first free elections in decades. They were also a test of whether democracy could take root. Turnout was high despite insurgent threats. Millions of Iraqis voted. The images of Iraqis holding up ink-stained fingers, showing they had voted, were broadcast worldwide. The Bush administration celebrated the elections as proof that democracy was working, but the elections also revealed deep sectarian divisions. The Shia majority voted for Shia religious parties. Kurds voted for Kurdish parties. Sunni Arabs largely boycotted the elections in protest of the occupation and their loss of power. The resulting government was dominated by Shia and Kurdish parties. Sunni Arabs were marginalized. This political exclusion reinforced the insurgency. Sunnis who might have participated in politics instead supported armed resistance. The elections were democratic but divisive. They pushed Iraq closer to civil war. The year 2005 brought hope for political progress but delivered escalating violence. The transitional government struggled to function amid the insurgency. Prime Minister Ibrahim al-Jafari led a coalition that represented Iraq's ethnic and sectarian diversity on paper but was paralyzed by internal divisions. The government's weakness became apparent immediately. Ministries were divided among political parties that treated them as patronage operations. Corruption flourished. Basic services remained terrible. Electricity was sporadic. Water quality was poor. Garbage piled in the streets. Iraqis saw little improvement in their daily lives. The constitutional referendum in October 2005 was another milestone in Iraq's political transition. The new constitution enshrined democratic principles and protected minority rights. It established Iraq as a federal parliamentary democracy. It recognized Kurdish autonomy. It addressed oil revenue distribution. But the constitution was controversial. Sunni Arabs opposed provisions they saw as weakening central authority and favoring Shia and Kurdish interests. The referendum passed, but the sectarian divide was evident in voting patterns. Shia and Kurdish areas overwhelmingly supported it. Sunni areas voted against it. The constitution formalized divisions rather than bridging them. The December 2005 parliamentary elections produced Iraq's first full-term government under the new constitution. Turnout was higher than previous elections as Sunni Arabs participated this time. But the results deepened sectarian politics. Voters chose parties based primarily on sectarian and ethnic identity. The Shia United Iraqi Alliance won the most seats. Kurdish parties won the second largest bloc. Sunni parties came third. Negotiations to form a government lasted months. The sectarian bargaining over positions reinforced the system of muhassasa, sectarian apportionment, that would plague Iraqi politics for years. The bombing of the Al-Askari Mosque in Samarra on February 22, 2006, was the match that ignited full-scale sectarian civil war. The mosque housed the tombs of two revered Shia imams. It was one of the holiest sites in Shia Islam. Bombers destroyed the golden dome that topped the mosque. The attack was designed to provoke Shia retaliation. It succeeded catastrophically. Within hours, Shia militias attacked Sunni mosques and neighborhoods. Sunni insurgents retaliated. The cycle of sectarian killing spiraled out of control. The violence that followed the Samarra bombing was horrific. Sectarian death squads roamed Baghdad and other mixed cities. Bodies turned up daily in streets and garbage dumps. Many showed signs of torture. Victims were identified by their names, which often indicated their sectarian identity. Neighborhoods that had been mixed for generations emptied as families fled to areas controlled by their own sect. Sunnis fled to Sunni areas. Shia fled to Shia areas. Baghdad was cleansed along sectarian lines through mass killing and forced displacement. The Iraqi police and army were deeply infiltrated by sectarian militias. Interior Ministry forces, dominated by Shia parties, ran death squads that kidnapped and killed Sunnis. National police units committed massacres. Iraqi army units were unreliable. Soldiers often refused to operate outside their own sectarian areas. Equipment disappeared. Units existed on paper but not in reality. American forces could not trust their Iraqi partners. The force that was supposed to provide security was often part of the problem. Building capable and non-sectarian Iraqi security forces proved far more difficult than anticipated. Nouri al-Maliki became prime minister in May 2006. He was a Shia Islamist politician from the Dawa party. Maliki had spent years in exile opposing Saddam. He was chosen as a compromise candidate acceptable to various factions. He was expected to be weak and pliable, but Maliki proved more stubborn and sectarian than anticipated. He consolidated power, he politicized security forces. He marginalized Sunni politicians. He saw politics through a sectarian lens. His divisive approach worsened the Civil War and sowed seeds for future crises. American casualties mounted through 2006 as the sectarian war raged. Over 800 American service members were killed that year. Thousands more were wounded. The violence peaked in October, with daily attacks reaching unprecedented levels. The mission had shifted from fighting insurgents to preventing civil war. American forces conducted patrols in mixed neighborhoods trying to keep sectarian militias apart. They raided death squad hideouts. They trained Iraqi forces. They built walls to separate Sunni and Shia neighborhoods. But they could not stop the sectarian killing. The American public was turning against the war. Support had been declining since weapons of mass destruction were not found. The insurgency's persistence eroded confidence. Abu Ghraib had damaged moral authority. The sectarian civil war suggested Iraq was descending into chaos despite years of American sacrifice. The November 2006 midterm elections became a referendum on the war. Democrats won control of both houses of Congress. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld resigned the day after the election. The political pressure for change was mounting. The Iraq Study Group report, released in December 2006, called for a new approach. The bipartisan panel, co-chaired by former Secretary of State James Baker and former Congressman Lee Hamilton, concluded that the situation in Iraq was grave and deteriorating. They recommended engaging Syria and Iran. They suggested transitioning to a support role and beginning withdrawal. The report was widely discussed but largely ignored. The Bush administration was already developing a different approach. Instead of withdrawing, they would surge. The decision to surge forces into Iraq was controversial and risky. Conventional wisdom suggested the war was lost and America should cut its losses. But President Bush and his advisors believed that one more push could stabilize Iraq. General David Petraeus was given command of forces in Iraq. He was a counterinsurgency expert who had written the Army's new counterinsurgency manual. The plan was to send approximately 30,000 additional troops to secure Baghdad and Anbar province. These forces would protect the population rather than simply hunt insurgents. The strategy was comprehensive but required time to work. The surge began in early 2007. Additional combat brigades deployed to Iraq. They moved into small outposts in Iraqi neighborhoods. They conducted foot patrols. They met with local leaders. The goal was to establish security and build relationships. The increased presence made American forces more vulnerable. Casualties spiked as forces operated in dangerous areas. The first months of the surge were the bloodiest of the war. Over 900 American service members died in 2007. The political pressure to declare the surge a failure and withdrawal was intense. The Anbar Awakening was a game-changing development that coincided with the surge. Sunni tribes in Anbar province had initially supported the insurgency, but they turned against al-Qaeda in Iraq because of its brutality and extremism. Al-Qaeda had tried to impose its strict interpretation of Islam on tribal areas. They killed tribal leaders who resisted. They forbade smoking and traditional practices. They claimed the right to marry tribal women. This interference in tribal affairs provoked a backlash. Tribal leaders formed the Anbar Awakening and allied with American forces against al-Qaeda. The Sons of Iraq program expanded the awakening model across the country. American forces paid former insurgents to switch sides and fight al-Qaeda. Tens of thousands of Sunni men joined local security groups. They manned checkpoints. They provided intelligence. They fought alongside American forces. The program was controversial. The Iraqi government viewed these groups with suspicion. Paying people who had killed American soldiers seemed morally questionable. But the program worked tactically. Violence decreased dramatically in areas where Sons of Iraq operated. The Battle of Sadr City in spring 2008 demonstrated the surge's effects. Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army had controlled eastern Baghdad's vast slum. American forces launched an operation to clear the militia from the area. The fighting was intense but relatively brief. The Mahdi army was defeated and forced to accept a ceasefire. Sadr himself fled to Iran. The operation showed that American and Iraqi forces could now defeat militias that had operated with impunity. The success reflected improved coordination and capability. By late 2008, violence had declined dramatically. Attacks dropped to levels not seen since early in the war. Civilian deaths decreased. American casualties fell. The surge appeared to have worked, but the reasons for reduced violence were complex. The surge provided more troops and a better strategy. The awakening turned Sunni fighters against al-Qaeda. Sectarian cleansing had separated populations, reducing opportunities for violence. Muqtada al-Sadr's ceasefire took Mahdi army fighters off the streets. Al-Qaeda had been weakened by killing and capturing its leaders. Multiple factors contributed to the improvement. The political progress that was supposed to follow military success was slower and more limited. Iraqi politicians did not reconcile their differences. The government remained sectarian and corrupt. Provincial elections in 2009 shifted power balances but did not fundamentally change the system. Maliki consolidated control and marginalized opposition. Sunni politicians who had supported the awakening found themselves sidelined. The Sons of Iraq were supposed to be integrated into Iraqi security forces, but many were not. They were left unemployed and disillusioned. The political gains did not match the security gains. Barack Obama was elected president in November 2008 partly on his opposition to the Iraq War. He had opposed the war from the beginning. He promised to end it responsibly. His administration negotiated a status of forces agreement with Iraq that required American forces to withdraw by the end of 2011. The timeline was tight, but politically necessary. Obama wanted to fulfill his campaign promise. The American public wanted the war over. The withdrawal would proceed regardless of conditions on the ground. The withdrawal began gradually in 2009. Combat brigades were replaced with training and advisory units. Bases were closed. Equipment was shipped home. The Iraqi government took increasing responsibility for security. The transition was called Operation New Dawn to signal the change from combat to support. But American forces continued to conduct combat operations when necessary. The distinction between combat and advisory missions was often unclear. American soldiers continued to die even as the war wound down. Maliki's increasing authoritarianism created problems. He used security forces against political opponents. He arrested rivals on terrorism charges. He refused to share power meaningfully with Sunni and Kurdish politicians. His paranoid and sectarian approach alienated Sunni Arabs. The grievances that had fueled the insurgency were reasserting themselves. American officials warned Maliki that his behavior was destabilizing. But American leverage was diminishing as withdrawal approached. Maliki knew America was leaving. He calculated he could act with increasing impunity. The disputed 2010 parliamentary elections revealed Iraq's dysfunction. The Iraqi coalition, which included many Sunni politicians, won the most seats. Under normal democratic procedures, they should have formed the government. But Maliki refused to accept the results. He maneuvered politically and obtained Iranian support. After months of deadlock, he retained the prime minister position. The process took nearly a year. The subversion of democratic outcomes demonstrated that Iraq's democratic institutions remained weak. Voters learned that elections could be overridden by backroom dealing. American forces officially ended combat operations in August 2010. President Obama addressed the nation to mark the milestone. He said the American combat mission in Iraq has ended, but approximately 50,000 American troops remained in advisory roles. They continued to support Iraqi forces. They conducted some combat operations. The distinction between combat and non-combat was semantic, but the announcement signaled that America was winding down its involvement regardless of conditions. The final withdrawal of American forces occurred in December 2011. The last convoy crossed from Iraq into Kuwait. The American flag was lowered at bases across Iraq. Equipment that could not be shipped home was given to Iraqi forces or destroyed. The withdrawal completed on schedule as required by the Status of Forces Agreement. President Obama announced that the war was over and American forces were coming home. Troops received heroes' welcomes when they returned, but the reception was muted compared to previous wars. The public wanted to forget Iraq and move on. The cost of the war was staggering. Approximately 4,500 American service members died in Iraq. More than 32,000 were wounded. Many wounded veterans suffered traumatic brain injuries, PTSD, and permanent disabilities. The financial cost exceeded $1 trillion, including long-term veteran care. Iraqi casualties were far higher. Estimates vary, but at least 200,000 Iraqis died from direct war violence. Many more died from indirect effects, including disease, malnutrition, and infrastructure collapse. Millions were displaced internally or became refugees. The social fabric of Iraq was torn apart. The destruction of Iraq's infrastructure and economy would take decades to repair. Power generation never returned to pre-war levels during the occupation. Water treatment was inadequate. Healthcare system was damaged. Schools were destroyed or lacked resources. The professional class fled Iraq in large numbers. Doctors, engineers, professors, and others left for safer countries. The brain drain hollowed out Iraq's human capital. Reconstruction projects were often corrupt and ineffective. Billions of dollars disappeared into contractors' pockets. Infrastructure built by Americans often did not function after handover. The war transformed the Middle East in ways its architects had not anticipated. Iran was the primary beneficiary. America destroyed Iran's primary enemy, Saddam Hussein, at enormous cost. The Shia-dominated Iraqi government was closely aligned with Iran. Iranian influence extended through Iraq to Syria and Lebanon. The Sunni Arab states watched with alarm as Iranian power grew. The regional balance of power had shifted decisively. The Sunni-Shia sectarian divide deepened across the region. The Iraq War accelerated trends that would contribute to the Arab Spring and subsequent conflicts. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated by the Surge and the Awakening. Zarqawi had been killed in 2006. His successors were killed or captured. The organization was broken and dispersed, but it was not destroyed. Remnants survived in Syria, where civil war created new opportunities. The group rebranded as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Under new leadership, it would return to Iraq when American forces left and Maliki's sectarian policies created new grievances. The seeds of ISIS were planted during the Iraq War. The decision to invade Iraq was based on false premises and led to catastrophic consequences. No weapons of mass destruction were found. The connection between Saddam and Al-Qaeda was non-existent. The idea that Iraq would become a democratic model for the Middle East proved naive. The assumption that Iraqis would welcome liberation was partly true but incomplete. The belief that the war would be quick and cheap was delusional. Each assumption proved wrong. The gap between expectations and reality was enormous. The war became a textbook case of strategic failure. The question of whether the surge worked is complex. Violence decreased dramatically in 2007 and 2008. American and Iraqi forces gained control of areas that had been insurgent strongholds. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated. These were real achievements. But the surge's tactical success did not produce lasting strategic success. The political reconciliation that was supposed to follow security gains never materialized. Maliki's sectarian policies recreated the conditions for insurgency. When American forces left, the fragile stability collapsed. The surge bought time but did not solve Iraq's fundamental problems. The experience of veterans returning from Iraq was often difficult. Many struggled with physical injuries and psychological trauma. PTSD rates were high. Traumatic brain injuries from IED blasts caused lasting cognitive and emotional problems. Suicide rates among veterans were alarmingly high. The transition to civilian life was challenging. Many felt the war had been a waste. They had sacrificed for goals that were not achieved. They had lost friends for nothing. The sense of futility compounded the trauma. Veterans groups and the VA struggled to provide adequate care and support. The legacy of the Iraq War extended far beyond the December 2011 withdrawal. The decision to invade Iraq in 2003 was perhaps the most consequential American foreign policy blunder since Vietnam. It damaged American credibility worldwide. It consumed resources that could have been used in Afghanistan. It empowered Iran. It created ISIS. It deepened sectarian divisions across the Middle East. It cost thousands of American lives and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives. It cost trillions of dollars. The war's ripple effects would shape global politics for decades. The intelligence failures that led to the war prompted soul-searching and reform. The National Intelligence estimate that concluded Iraq had weapons of mass destruction was based on faulty assumptions, unreliable sources, and political pressure. Intelligence analysts had cherry-picked evidence supporting conclusions policymakers wanted. Dissenting views were suppressed. The failure was both analytical and institutional. Reforms were implemented to improve intelligence quality and prevent politicization. But the damage to intelligence community credibility was severe. The claim that intelligence supported invading another country would be met with deep skepticism for years. Colin Powell's presentation to the United Nations became a symbol of the war's false pretenses. Powell had staked his personal credibility on claims that proved false. The mobile biological weapons labs did not exist. The aluminum tubes were not for nuclear enrichment. The connection between Iraq and Al-Qaeda was fictional. Powell later called the presentation a blot on his record. He acknowledged that the intelligence was wrong and that he had unknowingly misled the world. His willingness to admit error was admirable, but it could not undo the damage. The false UN presentation undermined future American diplomacy. The torture and abuse that occurred at Abu Ghraib and other detention facilities reflected a broader moral failure. Enhanced interrogation techniques authorized for terrorism suspects created an environment where abuse occurred. The legal memos from the Justice Department that authorized harsh treatment were deeply flawed. They defined torture narrowly to permit techniques that were clearly abusive. The photographs from Abu Ghraib showed the predictable result. Low-ranking soldiers were prosecuted. But the architects of the interrogation policies faced no consequences. The stain on American moral authority persisted. The impact of the war on American civil-military relations was significant. The Bush administration had relied heavily on military leaders to sell the war to skeptical publics. General Petraeus became the face of the surge strategy. His testimony to Congress in September 2007 was politically crucial. Petraeus reported progress and requested more time. His credibility as a military professional gave political cover to continue the war. But this blurred the line between military advice and political advocacy. Officers were placed in positions where their professional assessments had direct political implications. This complicated the traditional civil-military relationship. The cost of the war to American soft power was immense. Before Iraq, America could claim moral leadership based on democratic values and respect for international law. The invasion without clear UN authorization undermined that claim. The absence of weapons of mass destruction suggested America had lied or been incompetent. Abu Ghraib contradicted American values. The occupation's failures damaged claims of American competence. Global public opinion turned sharply against America. Even traditional allies questioned American judgment. The reservoir of goodwill built up over decades was squandered in a few years. The war's impact on terrorism was paradoxical. The Bush administration claimed the war was part of the broader war on terror. They suggested that fighting terrorists in Iraq prevented attacks on America, but the invasion actually increased terrorism. Iraq became a training ground and recruitment tool for jihadists. Foreign fighters flooded into Iraq to fight Americans. They gained combat experience and connections. The Iraq War validated bin Laden's narrative about American crusader intentions. It provided propaganda for terrorist recruitment globally. Measured against its stated goal of reducing terrorism, the war was counterproductive. The economic cost of the war contributed to America's fiscal problems. The war was funded primarily through borrowing rather than taxes. This disguised the true cost from the public. The Bush administration never requested that Americans sacrifice financially for the war. Taxes were actually cut during wartime. The cost was pushed to future generations through debt. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, America faced massive deficits, partly attributable to war spending. The economic consequences of the war would compound for decades through debt service and veteran care costs. The privatization of military functions during the Iraq War reached unprecedented levels. Private contractors performed tasks from food service to security. At some points, contractors outnumbered military personnel in Iraq. Companies like Blackwater, DynCorp, and KBR made billions from Iraq contracts. The privatization was driven by the desire to keep official troop numbers low and by ideological preference for private sector solutions. But it created problems. Contractor misconduct sometimes went unpunished. Costs ballooned. Oversight was inadequate. The use of contractors raised fundamental questions about accountability and the role of private actors in warfare. The Blackwater incident in Nisr Square on September 17, 2007, illustrated the problems with private security contractors. Blackwater guards protecting a State Department convoy opened fire in a crowded Baghdad square. They killed 17 Iraqi civilians and wounded 20 others. The contractors claimed they were responding to threats. Iraqi witnesses said the shooting was unprovoked. The incident created diplomatic crisis. Iraqi government demanded Blackwater leave Iraq. The legal status of contractors was unclear. Prosecuting them proved difficult. The case dragged through courts for years. It damaged America's relationship with Iraq and highlighted the accountability gap created by privatization. The medical advances made during the Iraq War saved lives but created new challenges. Body armor and rapid evacuation meant soldiers survived wounds that would have been fatal in previous wars. The survival rate for wounded soldiers was higher than any previous conflict, but many survivors had catastrophic injuries. Traumatic amputations were common from IED blasts. Traumatic brain injuries from blast waves caused invisible wounds. Burns from vehicle fires left soldiers disfigured. The VA and military medical system struggled to care for these wounded warriors. The advances in saving lives created an expanding population of severely disabled veterans requiring lifetime care. The impact on military families was severe and often overlooked. Multiple deployments became normal. Soldiers and Marines deployed to Iraq 2, 3, or 4 times. Each deployment lasted a year or more. Families endured repeated separations and constant fear. Spouses became single parents for extended periods. Children grew up with parents deployed. Divorce rates increased. Domestic violence increased. Military families bore enormous burdens, while most American civilian families were unaffected by the war. The all-volunteer force concentrated sacrifice on a small segment of society. The Iraqi refugee crisis created by the war was massive. Over 4 million Iraqis were displaced by the conflict. Approximately 2 million fled to neighboring countries, particularly Syria and Jordan. Another 2 million were internally displaced within Iraq. The refugees included many who had worked with coalition forces and were targeted for it. America accepted only a small fraction of Iraqi refugees despite moral obligations to those who helped American forces. The slow processing of refugee applications left many in dangerous limbo. The failure to protect Iraqi allies who supported America was a moral stain. The withdrawal of American forces in 2011 left Iraq in a precarious position. Maliki's government was increasingly authoritarian and sectarian. Sunni Arabs felt marginalized politically and persecuted by security forces. The Sons of Iraq program that had turned Sunnis against al-Qaeda was being dismantled. Former insurgents who had been paid to fight al-Qaeda were now unemployed and alienated again. The conditions that had fueled the original insurgency were reasserting themselves. American officials warned that Iraq could collapse without continued American presence and pressure on Maliki. Their warnings were prescient. The Obama administration attempted to negotiate an agreement for some American forces to remain in Iraq beyond 2011. They wanted a residual force to train Iraqi troops and conduct counterterrorism. But negotiations failed. The Iraqi government demanded that American forces be subject to Iraqi law. The United States refused to accept this. Maliki was simultaneously negotiating in bad faith. He wanted Americans to leave so he could consolidate power without external pressure. The status of forces agreement expired. All American forces withdrew. The failure to maintain presence would have terrible consequences. The Syrian civil war that began in 2011 had profound effects on Iraq. The conflict sent refugees flooding across borders. It created ungoverned spaces where extremists could operate. Most significantly, it allowed the Islamic State to rebuild in Syria and then return to Iraq. The porous border between Syria and Iraq meant instability in one country affected the other. The Arab Spring uprisings that included Syria were partly inspired by Iraq's earlier experience. The regional instability that the Iraq War had helped create was now feeding back into Iraq. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria emerged from the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Under new leadership, particularly Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the group rebuilt in Syria's chaos. They recruited foreign fighters. They seized territory and resources. They rebranded as ISIS with ambitions beyond Iraq. In 2013 and early 2014, they moved back into Iraq. They exploited Sunni grievances against Maliki's sectarian government. They portrayed themselves as protectors of Sunnis against Shia oppression. Their message found receptive audience among alienated Sunni communities. The fall of Mosul in June 2014 was a catastrophic collapse. ISIS forces numbering perhaps 1,500 attacked Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city. The Iraqi army had approximately 30,000 troops in the city. They should have easily defended against the assault. Instead, they collapsed and fled. Soldiers abandoned uniforms, weapons, and vehicles. They vanished into the civilian population. ISIS captured massive amounts of American-supplied military equipment, including vehicles, artillery, and small arms. The images of ISIS fighters parading captured American Humvees were humiliating. The fall of Mosul exposed the complete failure of Iraqi security force development. The United States had spent 8 years and billions of dollars training and equipping the Iraqi army. That force dissolved at first contact with a numerically inferior enemy. The reasons were clear in hindsight. The Iraqi army was riddled with corruption. Units existed only on paper. Commanders sold positions and pocketed salaries. Soldiers had not been paid. They had no loyalty to the corrupt government. They had no will to fight and die for leaders who stole from them. The institution was hollow despite its impressive order of battle. ISIS's territorial control expanded rapidly after Mosul. They seized Tikrit, Fallujah, Ramadi, and large swaths of northern and western Iraq. They declared a caliphate with Baghdadi as caliph. They governed territory and population. They extracted resources. They imposed their brutal interpretation of Islamic law. They massacred religious minorities. They enslaved Yazidi women. They destroyed ancient archaeological sites. They produced slick propaganda videos showing executions and battlefield victories. ISIS became the most powerful terrorist organization in history because of the vacuum created when American forces left Iraq. The Mosul collapse forced the Obama administration to return to Iraq militarily. American forces had left in 2011. Now they were returning in 2014 to prevent complete Iraqi government collapse. The mission was different than before. American forces would not conduct major ground operations. Instead, they would conduct airstrikes, provide training and equipment, and embed advisors with Iraqi units. The operation was called Inherent Resolve. It would continue for years. The promise that the Iraq War was over proved false. America was drawn back in to deal with problems partly created by the earlier intervention. Maliki's sectarian leadership had created the conditions for ISIS's success. His policies had alienated Sunni Arabs. His security forces were corrupt and ineffective. His refusal to share power had destabilized Iraq. Under American and Iranian pressure, Maliki was finally removed from power in 2014. Haider al-Abadi became prime minister. Abadi was more inclusive and competent than Maliki, but he inherited a broken country facing existential crisis. He had to rebuild security forces while simultaneously fighting ISIS. He had to reconcile sectarian divisions while under attack. He had to govern despite dysfunctional institutions. The campaign to defeat ISIS in Iraq took years. Iraqi forces, supported by American airstrikes and advisors, gradually pushed ISIS back. The battle for Ramadi in 2015 was slow and costly. The battle for Fallujah in 2016 was even harder. The siege and battle for Mosul from 2016 to 2017 was the largest urban battle since World War II. Iraqi forces fought block by block through the city. The destruction was immense. Thousands died. Much of the city was reduced to rubble. ISIS was eventually defeated militarily, but the victory came at terrible cost. The question of whether the Iraq War was worth its cost has no satisfying answer. The war removed a brutal dictator. That was morally good. It gave Iraqis an opportunity to build democracy. Elections were held and some democratic institutions created. But the cost was staggering. Thousands of Americans died. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died. The country was devastated. Sectarian conflict was unleashed. ISIS emerged. Iran's power grew. American credibility was damaged. Democracy in Iraq remained fragile and corrupt. Whether these limited gains justified the enormous costs is a question individuals must answer based on their values and priorities. Veterans of the Iraq War grappled with the meaning of their service. Many believed they had served honorably even if the war's strategic goals were not achieved. They took pride in their personal performance and the bonds formed with fellow service members. They helped individual Iraqis even if they could not fix Iraq's larger problems. Others felt betrayed by leaders who sent them to war based on false pretenses. They struggled with the knowledge that friends died for lies about weapons that did not exist. The psychological burden of reconciling sacrifice with failure was immense. The impact on Iraqi society will last generations. An entire generation grew up in war. Children witnessed horrific violence. Families were torn apart. Communities were destroyed. Trust between sects was broken. The professional and educated classes fled. Infrastructure was damaged. Institutions were corrupted. The trauma was collective and deep. Iraq's recovery would require not just rebuilding buildings, but healing social wounds. That process had barely begun when American forces left. The scars of war would mark Iraqi society for decades. The Iraq War fundamentally changed American politics and foreign policy. The war divided the country. It contributed to political polarization. The false premises for war created deep cynicism about government. The failure damaged confidence in American institutions. The experience made Americans deeply skeptical of military intervention. The appetite for nation building evaporated. The willingness to trust government claims about foreign threats declined. Future presidents would find it difficult to rally public support for military action. The Iraq Syndrome paralleled the Vietnam Syndrome. America had learned again the limits of military power. The lessons of the Iraq War were debated endlessly. Some argued the war proved that regime change and democracy promotion were impossible. Others argued that the war could have succeeded with better planning and execution. Some believed the withdrawal in 2011 squandered the surge's gains. Others believed staying longer would only have postponed inevitable failure. The debate reflected different values, assumptions, and interpretations. There was no consensus on lessons learned. This ensured that future policymakers would draw different conclusions. The risk of repeating Iraq's mistakes remained. The accountability for the Iraq War's failures was limited. President Bush and his senior officials left office without facing consequences for the catastrophic decisions they made. Intelligence officials who provided flawed assessments retired with pensions. Military leaders who failed to stabilize Iraq went on to other positions. Contractors who wasted billions faced little accountability. The lack of consequences for failure was troubling. It suggested that those responsible for catastrophic decisions faced no meaningful penalties. This created moral hazard for future decision makers. The Iraq War Memorial that does not yet exist would need to honor multiple truths. It would honor the service and sacrifice of American troops who did their duty honorably. It would acknowledge the Iraqi civilians who suffered and died. It would recognize the translators and others who helped Americans at great risk. It would remember the journalists and aid workers who died reporting and helping. It would also serve as a warning about the costs of war based on false premises. Such a memorial would force Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about power, hubris, and the limits of military force. 20 years after the invasion, Iraq remained troubled. Democracy was fragile. Corruption was endemic. Sectarian tensions persisted. Iranian influence was strong. ISIS was defeated but not eliminated. Infrastructure was inadequate. The economy struggled despite oil wealth. Young Iraqis who had known only war dreamed of leaving. The promise that the war would create a stable, democratic Iraq had not been fulfilled. The country was better than under Saddam in some ways. It was worse in others. The balance sheet was mixed at best. Whether future generations would achieve the peace and prosperity promised in 2003 remained uncertain. The question that haunts the Iraq War is what was accomplished that justified the cost. Removing Saddam was a legitimate goal if he had possessed WMD and threatened America. But he possessed no such weapons. The threat was fabricated or imagined. Building democracy was a worthy aspiration, but democracy imposed by foreign occupation is fragile and faces enormous challenges. The cost in lives and treasure was enormous. The gains were limited and reversible. The unintended consequences were catastrophic. The invasion of Iraq stands as a tragic example of how even well-intentioned intervention can produce disaster when based on false premises and inadequate planning. The war's legacy is a cautionary tale for generations to come.